I'm sure the people who are listening in right now are fascinated by my upcoming move and your visit to the southern part of Virginia, but we'll talk more about that later. We're really so delighted at the NAA to have once again Richard Aboulafia on with us. Richard is managing director of Aerodynamic Advisory, which is a firm that advises on aerospace strategy and growth, MROs, transaction support, economic development, and those sorts of things. His commentary on aerospace and aviation is widely sought after. You've probably seen things he said in places like AvWeek, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, other places like that. Before that, he was the vice president of analysis at the Teal Group. He's a fellow of the Royal Aeronautics Society, and he is, as annual visitors to this webinar or attendees at our luncheons know, also an avid beer drinker, and usually has a beer with him. And then I usually have one as well. So Richard, we're going to get you to reveal your beer first.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Today's webinar is, I guess, partly brought to you by Manor Hill IPA. Normally, as you know, we get something more relevant. We keep waiting for them to establish a crazy forecaster brewing company or something like that. So we'll have to put up with a perfectly normally named beer now.
Richard, now that I'm retiring, maybe we can set that brewery up. And I'm happy to.
I'm listening.
And so your webinar says other unhelpful suggestions. For those suggestions that are not helpful, I'm later, not at 5 o'clock, not yet, going to be using my Aviation gin, which is always helpful. So I thought that was appropriate today. So anyway, without further ado, we have a number of folks joining and just kind of a rolling thing. For those of you who are tuning in, you'll be able later to get a link to the entire webinar and to the slides and so forth. And having previewed the slides, I can tell you you're going to really enjoy this. So Richard, I'm going to turn off my microphone, turn off my video, and turn this over to you.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Greg. And thanks to the NAA for hosting. I guess it's been 8 or 9 years, always with a different beer and always with a different message. Thanks for putting the presentation up there, Tina. Basically, this is the first year I've felt, for 35 years, I've tracked aircraft programs and companies and most of all markets. And this is the one year where I can honestly say perhaps that markets don't matter very much. Not that they're completely irrelevant, but this has become a story about the supply side, the production side, rather than the market or demand side. For 35 years, I've been tracking markets. It's really about the production side. So it's really good that most of the people in my company, Aerodynamic Advisory, focus on the supply chain, the production side, because they're the ones who really tell me what's going on now, because we're not limited by the market's demand. And I don't think we will be limited by the market's demand for rather a long time, at least 5, maybe 10 years. It's really a story about production. And I'll walk you through all of the major concerns there in this presentation. On the positive side, to put a happy spin on things, from a market mechanics standpoint, I haven't seen things this good in a very long time. It's just a question of building them. Next page, please, Tina. Thanks. First of all, a little representation of my career in numbers. I joined in 1988, if memory serves, and started tracking numbers. And you can see where we've come from. And you can also see what a nasty, sharp drop 2020 was for all the reasons that we're all too painfully familiar with. Not all of it was market-based. A lot of it, again, was on the production side. You had inevitable factory closures, supply chain snafus, people unwilling or unable to take delivery of their aircraft because of travel restrictions. Basically, you can see we suffered the worst one-year drop in the history of the business. We've had cyclical downturns, particularly on the civil side, but never anything like the kind of fall off a cliff freeze moment that we experienced in 2020. Even the military side took a bit of a hit. Even last year, military demand, as you'll see in a moment, is particularly strong for all the reasons you know from reading the daily newspaper. And yet, the production side has been really badly stumbling for all the reasons that many of you in the industry are familiar with. Another thing you'll notice in 21, 22, boy, look at that anemic recovery. I mean, we were knocked back down to, as a market, 20 years ago. It was just, we fell back to where we were 2 decades ago. And the recovery has just been extremely modest. And again, it's not the market. It is purely about the production side and recovering from a very difficult situation. Next page, please. Now, there are a whole bunch of issues that are in the world of macroeconomics and macro geopolitics, whatever else, geostrategy, that inform the microeconomics of our industry. And about 6 months ago, I read a terrific piece in Foreign Affairs magazine by the head economist of Allianz, Dr. Mohammed El Arian. You can see the link there at the footnote below. I really like this article, but basically he said, look, no matter what industry you're in, there are 4 things that are hitting you. And this resonated with me. So I graphed it up, or I had our people graph it up. And the top left corner really, I think, speaks to what we're experiencing. Dr. El-Arian said that for the first time, really in about half a century, the world economy can be defined not by inadequate demand, not by weak markets, but rather by weak output and production, inadequate supply. That is completely new, certainly in my lifespan, and I expect most of your lifespans too. Now, there's a whole host of stuff that's gone with that, including the return of industrial policy and the return of, well, shortened supply chains, more friendshoring, more people wanting to bring work back home and also come up with, well, nationally based capabilities in the event of a contingency. And all of that, of course, strains production resources, whether it's rejiggering supply chains or whether it's creating new in-house, new in-country capabilities, like, okay, we should build our own semiconductors. Let's build giant factories to build semiconductors. This takes away from supply, as you imagine it would. The other factors are actually more on the market side, but really haven't kicked in yet. The end of endless liquidity. That is very definitely a factor. The good old days of basically central banks saying, hey, show up with your wheelbarrow, we'll give you all the free money you want in perpetuity, they're over. There's going to be an impact on jetliner finance, an impact on company debt, an impact on new start investment fundings. Remember all those billion-dollar stacks that were showing up like magic a year or 2 ago? Those are gone. Top right, another issue, China goes dark. This is one, as you'll see in a moment, this is one of those issues that predates the pandemic, but China's move away from world trade partner, in general, good citizen, market economy, all of these things, it was all going so well, and they've decided that, well, maybe they didn't want it to go so well. This means, of course, less growth in the civil sector, slower air travel demand growth, a much greater security problem on so many different levels, and of course, a real problem for people who'd put production facilities or even MRO facilities in China. And then finally, you've got greater financial system fragility, and that shows up in all kinds of ways, including financing jets in emerging markets, especially now that Russia has become the first Cape Town Convention signatory state to basically abrogate that treaty. So these are the big factors, but really from the standpoint of what I'm concerned with, which is to say the industry's health, it's that supply problem that's really bedeviling us right now. Next page, please, Tina. Now, turning to defense, like I said, I joined in the sort of waning days of the Cold War, and after that, it became just a question of, all right, we're going to be on the plateau after all, and end of history, and end of, the world is flat. We never have to worry about fighting peer adversaries again. Things were going to be fine, and we all believe that, or at least a lot of us did. I certainly did. Well, obviously, history has resumed its unpleasant course, and as a consequence, everybody is rearming as fast as they possibly can. This just looks at the basket of what you might call addressable countries. So, if you include China, if you include Russia, if you include Iran, North Korea, whatever else, then defense spending in 2021 actually exceeded $2 trillion for the first time in history. Just looking at our basket, it's 1.5, but quickly gearing up to 2.4 by the end of the decade. Inflation is a bit of a wild card here. Obviously it has impacted some parts of the defense industry. We don't know how persistent it will be. It looks like it's easing a bit. We're forecasting 7% annual growth through 2029. It could need to go higher in the event of inflation persisting. Or alternatively, if it doesn't go higher, you'll see the actual value of these investments eroding somewhat. But right now, the base case assumption is very strong growth in defense. Next page, please. And of course, you're certainly seeing that in the US. If you look at the investment accounts, that is to say, procurement and RDT&E, you've got a very strong ramp. There we are in FY23, getting into FY24. And even before the plus-ups have begun, even before any of that, you have a world all-time record of $315 billion, 170 in procurement, 145 in research and development for the defense budget. That's fantastic. I didn't think I'd live to see these numbers again, but here we are. And again, it speaks to markets that are performing brilliantly. Very happy to see this demand. Not happy about the cause for it, which of course is the resumption of peer adversary threats and just general global tension. But from the standpoint of our industry, well, these are great times for the wrong reasons, but great times. Next page, please. Now, here's the output map for the US military aircraft. And it's an interesting story. Not much has gone away. It's sort of interesting. If we'd had this conversation a few years ago, the only production line that was around in the 80s that had died was the F-14. Everything else had persisted. F-22, of course, came and went, sadly. Now, what's happening, of course, is the F-35 is taking over. The F-35 alone is sort of a fascinating story of my thesis that markets aren't the problem, production is. You should be at 156 aircraft annually in terms of production. If you were to look at actual market demand, like if you could just flip a switch and have aircraft built, you should be at 200, maybe even more, because, let's face it, Vladimir Putin is the world's best F-35 salesman ever. And as a consequence, you look at the past 12 to 18 months, it's extraordinary how many new orders have come in from so many different countries, from Canada to Finland to Switzerland, most recently, even Romania and Thailand. Everyone's joining the club, but we're having a hard time building them. And, last year it was going to be 148, I believe, and it was only 141, I think, because of that production line shutdown, or I should say the delivery shutdown because of the F-35B flight control problem. This year was going to be 156 again. Looks like that'll disappoint. It's going to take some time before we get to the numbers as we should get them. Still, it's going to be a great decade for F-35 production. We're expecting by the middle of the decade to get to 156 and then even a little bit beyond. In the meantime, you've still got all the other lines. The F-A-18, as Boeing guidance indicates, probably will go away in 2026. At the top, you've got T-7 and B-21 joining. At the bottom there, you've got F-22 being replaced by NGAD. We have that in the same bucket just for ease of viewing. Same mission, so why not, right? This is a really great environment. As you can see, last year it was worth 20 billion. It's 30 billion by the end of the decade, and that's inflation adjusted this time. So very solid output numbers indeed. Next page, please. Now, a lot of people have been talking about the FAROWIN by Bell's V-280. Congratulations to Bell. I am not here to throw any cold water on that. V-280 was a tremendous win. It's going to be a very strong machine for the Army when it arrives around 2030 in terms of entering into service. But I'd caution people, it's not going to take over the world. You look at the impact of the V-22, ultimately over 500 were built, and you can see at the bottom in red the impact it had on the broader military rotorcraft market. You're probably going to see a repeat of that, right? Just because the Army and probably the Marines, probably SOCOM, probably a couple of foreign customers are going to buy FARA V-280. Output will probably be maybe 600, 700 maybe. Pretty good. It's really good. But that doesn't mean the market for everything else from Chinooks to Blackhawks to Apaches is going away, especially since I'm really not a FARA believer for a variety of reasons. So in other words, we're seeing limited transformation, but this machine is ultimately necessary for the Army to reinvent itself for Pacific Rim operations. Next page, please. Now, you want to see growth moving outside the Aero bucket. Oh my dear God, there is missiles and munitions. 23% increase in the FY24 budget alone. Talk about supply constraint. Whatever category of missile or munitions, we can't build them fast enough. I was out in Tucson about a month ago, and boy, the cranes are everywhere. Everybody is expanding missile and munition capability. The one thing we've learned, well, we've learned quite a few things, unfortunately, from the Russia's Ukraine invasion. But one is that when you're fighting a peer or near peer adversary, ammunition consumption rates are far greater than you anticipate. And sure enough, turns out most of NATO had been, well, creating a hollow force. So right now, everyone is trying to ramp up. Again, if you could flip a button overnight, you'd get this market from 20 to 40 billion instantly, probably 50 billion. It's just a question of how quickly it can ramp up. Meanwhile, everyone else from Australia to South Korea to whoever is saying, gee, well, we'd better be self-sufficient too. We'd better establish indigenous capabilities for production, for repair, for overhaul, for anything we can do to survive in the event of a conflict. And that, of course, is also creating great constraints upon the supply picture. Another complication, of course, is new technology in the form of hypersonics and new nuclear programs. That too is taking productive resources away from other things. I should also mention that historically, the second biggest producer in the world of military exports was Russia. And for reasons that are very obvious, that's going away quickly. Not just because of the dismal performance of Russian systems in the Ukraine invasion, but also because of sanctions, and also because of doubts about their ability to execute because of sanctions and whatever else. So it's most likely that Russia's going away. Emerging producers like Korea, like Turkey might just benefit. France is going to benefit very considerably. China might benefit. The stories about China's appeal as an arms exporter have been somewhat oversold, but nevertheless, it's fairly going to be one of the beneficiaries in some way or another. One interesting thing I look at, my colleagues and I survey the world of emerging programs. Nobody's doing much in the world of strategic lift. And obviously, when the last C-17 was delivered about 5 years ago, that was that. The A400M line is winding down. Everyone seems happy with what they've got, but they're also perhaps neglecting the fact that the existing fleets, particularly C-17s, are wearing out a lot faster than expected because of a high op tempo. So ultimately, we expect the Pentagon to start up a new strategic lift program in the next couple of years. That's going to be one of the key things to watch. Next page, please. Now, I'd like to turn over to the commercial side of things. First of all, the air traffic recovery is in full swing, doing great. Our latest numbers call for us to get back to where we were next year, but really this year, most of the way there. It's just China and intra-Asia that's a bit of a drag. However, I should mention that by late 2026, it's going to be a 17% impairment relative to where we would have been if this whole pandemic thing hadn't happened. So in other words, we're out of it. We're going to continue to grow beyond that, but it doesn't mean that there's not a hole taken out, particularly of international traffic, rather than domestic traffic. So that's a complication. Next page, please. one thing we look at after the issue of air traffic in terms of its demand or in terms of its impact on demand for commercial jetliners is the ratio between the cost of cash and the cost of fuel. And this is a moving target, of course. What you want is a world where cash is cheap to finance new jetliner transactions and fuel is expensive enough so that airlines feel the need to replace their older, thirstier jets with newer jets that are more efficient. And as you can see, the good news is fuel is in pretty good territory. You want it around 80 because, much more than that, airlines have a hard time either attracting passengers or making money. And if it's much less than that, then the old jets begin to look good. So 80 is really a Goldilocks number. It looks like we're there. Having said that, you can see from the inset chart, we've had some crazy mood swings in the world of fuel, including that very special moment back in April of 2020, where due to some technical glitch, they were paying you to take the stuff. Still not figured out how that actually functioned. Like, could I have just built a giant moat in my backyard and been paid to take fuel? I don't know how that worked. But anyway, things are good now. Cash, of course, this is a function of the Fed and other central banks needing to fight inflation. And the federal fund effective rate as of 2 weeks ago is now in the 5.1% range. It's a little high. I don't like it. I'm hoping it does. The general consensus is it's not going to go any higher. In an ideal world, it'd go back to zero. It's probably not going to do that. This, if you remember the start of my presentation, the issue of excess, the end of endless liquidity, you're really seeing that here. Things are getting a little tight. We expect things to ease off a bit, but still, it's kind of a different universe than the one we've been living in the last decade, where money was absolutely free to anybody who showed up with a wheelbarrow. Next page, please. Another thing to think about is China. For many years, whenever we were having a conversation about single aisle production, we were really talking about China, and its ability to take a marginally greater number of aircraft. 20 years ago, China was just 2% of the world market. At their peak, they were 23% of the world market. If you can go back one, please. And the problem is that China's market slowdown in air travel actually predates the pandemic. That's a real complication here. Basically, we don't know what growth rates in China are going to look like after the recovery. Thanks, that's perfect. As you can see, their intake of jets has slowed down markedly. And, a lot of people ask us, is India the new China? Well, maybe, but that's going to take a lot of time. It depends upon all sorts of demographic and infrastructure variables. For right now, in terms of recent history, China was the big growth market, and they're not there anymore. So we're hoping that changes. But again, China going dark is one of the great themes in aviation today. Next page, please. Good news, book to bill, the ratio of orders to deliveries, that's a thing again. And as you can see, in 21, we got our nose above water. 22 was even better. 2020, of course, was the first year in history where it wasn't calculable because there were more cancellations relative to new orders. But right now, things are looking good. If I had to put a guesstimate on 2023, ask me after the Paris Air Show, but I think it could be like 1.5 or even 2 to 1. Things are looking really good on the orders front. Now, that doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot when there's, such a huge backlog. But on the other hand, hey, it is an endorsement of market demand and how things are going. Next page, please. What we've got, though, is a really bifurcated market recovery for a variety of reasons, particularly international traffic being the part which was really hit most by the pandemic, but also because of the new capabilities of single aisle jets. The market for single aisles is so much stronger than twin aisles. Matter of fact, we don't see twin aisles getting back to the pre-pandemic peak until sometime in the next decade. But single aisles literally can't build them fast enough. Airbus moving, of course, to rate 75. That's probably going to take a year or two longer than they want. Boeing, of course, moving to rate 52. That's probably going to take a year or two longer than they want. But a very strong market for single. Next page, please. Now, one complication for Boeing is that when we talk about the boom market, it's really that 200-seat single aisle segment. And the A321neo is the jet that everyone wants. Good news yesterday, for good news for Boeing, yesterday Ryanair ordered 150 MAX 10s. So you can add that to the little, the single aisle component there for Boeing right in the middle. But still, there's no denying the ratio between 321neos and 737 MAX 10s is pretty huge. And that basically brings to mind our thesis that Boeing really needs to do something in this segment. Otherwise, the outcome is going to be a 70-30 market share. What was a duopoly becomes overwhelmingly Airbus and going to be very difficult for Boeing to respond, say, in 5 or 10 years time after Airbus runs away with this market. Next page, please. Now, a few comments about decarbonization and everything like that. Yeah, it's on top of mind for a lot of people, big issues. You know, we've been through this a lot as a company, and I'll just give you our quick thinking. First of all, there's a lot of interesting experimentation, but really in terms of decarbonization, SAF is pretty much the only game in town. Hydrogen does not look like a prospect till the 2050s at the very earliest, maybe never. Hybrid electric, maybe for intra-region to a certain extent sometime, you know, starting in the mid to late 2030s, but there are a lot of risks there and it's just a tiny fraction of traffic. Our number one conclusion is that there's definitely going to be another generation of conventionally powered single aisles entering service in the mid 2030s. This is absolutely crucial. Does it use a new high technology airframe like a truss brace wing or even a blended wing body? It might. Could it use new propulsion technology like an open rotor? Absolutely, but it's going to be conventionally powered. Belief that we're going to get rid of our carbonization problem with something other than SAF is really misplaced for the next 30 years at least. Next page, please. A few comments on MRO. Right now, you're in the middle of a tremendous MRO demand surge, military, air transport, and BizAv. You know, it's interesting, total market size is actually a bit bigger than new build when you put it all together. We track this very closely and it's very strong. In aggregate, the 10-year CAGR is 3.8%. Unfortunately, it's kind of labor intensive. And in an industry that's supply constrained, this boom is, of course, taking away productive resources from new build. So we have an industry that, getting back to the central theme here, really is quite supply constrained, and a lot of it comes down to labor. Next page, please. Now, on the subject of inflation, on the subject of supply constraints, first of all, there's this wonderful data set from the Federal Reserve there at the top chart that basically looks at stuff I don't care about, which is everything that's not an aircraft. The technical title for this data set is non-defense capital goods excluding aircraft. I take this personally. But the thing to look at the recovery from the recession and the pandemic. It is bat out of hell straight up. And that, of course, is a much faster rate of growth for everything from cars to computers to ping pong tables to carpets. Everything is in there except what I care about. Again, I take that personally. But all of this is bad because we're kind of last in line to hire people, to buy machine tools, to make investments. And as a consequence, we're kind of being slapped in the face with inflation. We're also being hit by the tremendous inflationary pressures of high defense spending, as you might expect, because unfortunately, defense contracts are routinely, at least 60% of the time, cost plus, which means whatever inflation there is, you know, it gets reimbursed by the taxpayer. The commercial world, there are pass-through provisions, but they're limited, and not everybody in the supply chain is fully protected from this being slapped in the face by inflation. Now, the bottom chart shows inflation by category. It's really interesting. All forms of inflation right now are ameliorating. Look at that bottom. There's actually negative inflation, deflation in energy. That's good. Goods inflation coming way down. Food come down. Everything is doing great except services, that is only increasing. What does that tell you? That tells you that the problem is labor. The problem, the inflationary pressure, all comes from workforce. And again, here is where our industry is extremely constrained. And part of me, I don't want to root for an economic slowdown. You know, we keep waiting for that recession they promised us, right? You know, it's the joke about forecasters have successfully predicted 12 of the last 6 downturns. The downturn doesn't seem to be happening, but if there were a downturn, hey, I hope those workers will come and work for the aerospace side of the economy, because we could use them, right? I mean, we're being subject to these tremendous inflationary pressures. And meanwhile, again, you know, it's very hard for the commercial side to get people away from defense. If you want to meet a former commercial aerospace worker, manufacturing or engineering, go visit Palmdale or Fort Worth, because that's where they are, right? And again, those are contracts that are typically cost plus, or at least have a greater level of protection against inflationary pressures. Next page, please. Another issue that I don't think we've quite grappled with, you know, we went through this sort of maze of problems on the production side: microchips, resins, engineered components. Some of it is kind of working itself out, you know, we're getting there, except for the titanium gorilla in the corner. And titanium, of course, comes in 2 delicious flavors. There's sponge, there's the raw material, where Russia plays a significant role, but it's not a big deal because it's a global commodity, and the Japanese have done great in ramping up output. I'm not overly worried about titanium sponge, but titanium mill product, look at Russia there. And that, of course, is something that requires enormous capital investments. And right now, people might not be making the kind of big investments they should, because they're concerned that Russia could come back online. And I should mention, Russia hasn't cut off production. Rather, it's Western firms that in many cases have stopped purchasing Russian titanium as their own sanction. So right now, I think we're in this position where we've got what we need, but if the war goes on and if Western companies don't make the necessary investments in mills, we could face a problem in a couple of years. So that's something that I think needs to be dealt with. Next page, please. Couple final comments before I turn over back to Greg for questions. Here we are on Recovery Road. Basically everything indexed back to the year 2019 or 2018 for 1 or 2 segments. And great news, everything is pretty much recovering this year. Next top, you've got world GDP that actually recovered in 21 and is still growing happily. As I mentioned, there is Aerodynamic Advisory's revenue passenger kilometers, air travel demand. You see that in the dotted red line. That's recovering, as I said, next year. Everything else is recovering this year, or has even recovered already. Like, for example, military there at the purple line at the top, towards the top. The only exception that's really of note is at the very bottom, twin aisle jets. That is pretty much the only area of concern. Now, with the A380 out of production and the 747 out of production, obviously that puts a little pressure off the other surviving designs, but nevertheless, the good old days of, you know, sky's the limit when it comes to 787, 777, A350, A330 output, those are behind us for now, and that'll persist for some time. Again, there's that bifurcation between single aisles and twin aisles. Final chart, next page, please, Tina. Thank you. I am aware, Greg, that we are the National Aeronautic Association, so I've got the national output numbers. Just looking at U.S. deliveries, and that, of course, is the blue bars corresponding to the left-hand side, and U.S. output as a percent of the world corresponding to the right-hand side. Great news. For the first time in a while, about 4 years, last year, we exceeded 50% of world output, probably going to increase because of the military segment, and as Boeing gets the 737 MAX up to speed again. So that's all good news, because as you can see, the trend had not been our friend for the previous decade. So this is a positive development for the nation's aerospace industries. With that, thanks so much for listening. I'll turn back over to Greg for questions.
So, Richard, there goes my plans to create the Intergalactic Aeronautical Association. So we have some great specific questions in the chat. I want to ask an overarching broad question first, and then we'll go to the ones in the chat. Over the last several years, we've often talked about the negative impact of policy and politics on all these things. And oftentimes, partisan disagreement, like we're seeing with the debt ceiling, tends to have a negative effect. You talked about the return of industrial policy and also China. There are two things that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on, and Trump and Biden seem to agree on, is industrial policy. All the Trump era industrial policies have, Jay Bolton just put a pretty funny chat in there about my Intergalactic Aeronautic Association. That's why I'm laughing. I'm sorry. But the tariffs and all the other things, Biden really hasn't changed. And having served on the Senate staff back in the 80s, I think that is where sort of his inclination is. And then on China as well, bipartisan agreement on those two issues goes from your presentation, maybe in a negative direction. Can you talk about that a little bit before we get to the specific questions?
Yeah, those are two great macro trends. Both sides do appear to agree that China is the #1 security threat. As they say, it's the pacing threat. Kath Hicks at the Pentagon defined Russia as the acute threat and China as the pacing threat, which means, of course, it'll be driving defense spending in an upward direction for the decade. That's what it means, right? And there is very strong bipartisan agreement on that. Similarly, selective sanctions, whatever, the Trump sanctions were a little bit blunt. The Biden ones are a little more targeted, particularly semiconductors, telecoms, and space systems, and whatever else. And that's kind of interesting, but it does depend upon worldwide buy-in. A lot of the lithography machines needed to create semiconductors come from the Netherlands. You got to get them agreeing to it, and getting the Europeans on board isn't always going to be easy. But you're right. As as a driver behind military demand, this is a very broad bipartisan consensus thing. Similarly, on industrial policy, wow, both parties seem inclined to work together to reject the Reagan-Thatcher free market, open borders legacy. Okay, industrial policy. Okay, tariffs. Okay, and before I blame America, Europe had led the way on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
With some of the various industrial strategy schemes, particularly for the development of green technologies over the past few years. So I think one sad reality is that you and I really had these careers that, span the great 3-decade era of free trade and open borders and globalization. And well, goodbye to all that, right? And on the positive side, though, that's all really good from the standpoint of spending on aerospace.
It's incredible how the political spectrum has changed on that. Jay Bolton has a great question about the V-280. It's under protest by Sikorsky, and how might that affect the adoption of FVL?
Yeah, it's been pretty much, the original protest was to the GAO, and the GAA said, no, go pound sand, it's over, forget it. And not very long ago, I'm pretty sure Lockheed Martin said it would not take them to court over that. So I think they're out of the woods. I think that's been removed as a major impediment. I think, I definitely checked that, but that's my understanding, that there are no major challenges. It just becomes a question of technology maturation, of course, and funding.
Scott Newman has a question. I think you and I have talked about this before, and I think it's a perennial question. Will UAM, AAM growth take up industrial capacity from other aerospace sectors?
Great question. I'm kind of worried. I was more worried, now I'm still worried, right? Because, you went to this, obviously there are a couple hundred wannabes in the UAM space, and you get there and you meet very talented, very often young people. And, I was like, wait a minute, can't you go work for the traditional side? We kind of need you, And again, I'm not rooting for human misery here, but part of me hopes that when the inevitable shakeout occurs in UAM, when they start going, out of business, hopefully there'll be a few happy survivors, but, I hope we get these people back because they're talented, right?
Yeah.
And it's an area of concern. I was also somewhat worried about, dragging investment capital away from stuff that I'd like to see in the traditional world funded. You had this period of SPACs, oh, you want $1 billion? Here, $500 million. Oh, wait a minute. That seems to be in the rearview mirror. So I'm a little less concerned now, but it's an interesting question. I think it's something we should be mindful of.
Chris Kerrigan asks about your take on e-fuel for net zero carbon emissions and for the emerging high-speed vertical takeoff and landing market.
Yeah, broadly, SAF can be broken down into stuff from feedstocks and stuff that's e-fuel, P2L. And it gets fiendishly complicated. The funny thing about aerodynamic is that there's 12 of us and I'm the only non-engineer, and all the smart people are trying to tell me the difference in the fine points and, the importance of using the right power source to make sure you're not just burning coal to create, to create e-fuel. It's really interesting. And it all comes down to economics and scaling. As I understand it, it's going to be a long time before we can get things down to the kind of prices we see. And perhaps it just isn't possible at P2L. So, you look at the limitations of feedstocks for that part of the SAF market, whether it's supply limitations or economics limitations or whatever, you realize that in many parts of that market, many parts of the globe, P2L is the way to go. Mm-hmm. And, you just have to worry whether it's always going to be a 10 bucket gallon sort of proposition. I don't know.
You talked before about the labor markets and all that, and certainly that whole world has changed over the last 3 or 4 years. I don't know that it'll ever go back. Angela Gittins wants to know whether the COVID era immigration restrictions contributed to the labor shortage and what should be done about immigration reform to help the economy.
Oh boy, yeah, that's absolutely right. H1B visas got to be in short supply, and I don't know what the policy answer is on that. I'd like to see more H1B visas. I would, but you got to see it as a global problem. People look at what is hobbling China's rise. Well, a big part of it is that talented people don't really want to emigrate to China. They really don't. They would not be welcome. And it just would be a colossally ill-advised move, just like emigrating to Russia would be. I think one of our great strengths, this is an open society that attracts talent. So aside from saying that, and aside from saying, yes, absolutely, that has been a complication on the labor supply, particularly for skilled workers. Not much more I can say or recommend, I'm afraid.
Well, you mentioned the Reagan era before, the Reagan-Thatcher era, and certainly President Reagan often talked about the advantage our open arms and welcome is to the talented people, and people whose talents may not be quite as obvious, but they've got that work ethic, from around the world who want to come here, like my grandfather, for example,
and mine too,
and make a better life. Yeah, they weren't engineers or anything, without getting too far into that, things certainly have changed. That's another one of those tough areas where the political spectrum has changed. By the way, when you're talking about your answer to Chris Kerrigan's question, he mentioned check out Prometheus fuels. I don't really know what that is, but I'll pass that along.
I will. I'm not familiar, but I will.
So another question, I don't really know what the question means, but I'm gonna read it out. Scott Newman wants to know, why hasn't Armstrong processed titanium made a difference in titanium production?
Oh boy, I wish I could tell you. I'm still stuck in Bessemer processed steel from my basic chemistry class way back in the day.
Well, I think my fake hip is made out of titanium, so I'm certainly hoping that those things last for a while.
I hope it's Armstrong.
Well, Brian Washko says, with the comment on liquidity challenges going forward, do you foresee more supplier consolidation into larger super tier ones?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a fascinating one. My good friend and co-managing director and company founder Kevin Michaels has this, sort of chart of how the second and third tier was hit. First they were smacked in the head with Boeing's Partnering for Success initiatives back in the 2000s. Then there was the MAX shutdown, and then icing on the cake, COVID. And basically they loaded up on debt. They fired or sold everything that couldn't be nailed down. And now they're being told, oh, find your own working capital for the ramp up. Have a nice day. Yes, that very strongly seems like a recipe for, if not consolidation or acquisition or something. So yeah, I mean, one of the great miracles of the whole pandemic was that we only had 3 bankruptcies. Part of it was prompt government action, paycheck protection programs. Part of it accelerated payments to contractors through the Pentagon and first-tier contractors. There were a lot of smart moves made, in short. Now, we're out of that, and those payments are no longer accelerated and whatever else. So that would appear to be a time for, well, if not greater outright absorption by the first tiers, then greater role for private equity at the second and third tier and merging folks together or orchestrating some kind of rationalization, consolidation, because a lot of these folks are having a heck of a time finding the capital needed to ramp up.
Yeah. So Scott Newman very helpfully wrote back that Armstrong is a production process for powdered titanium that can then be near net shaped rather than forged and milled. I know what each of those words means. I'm not sure what they mean together yet, but I'm gonna go look that up, Scott.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You continue to challenge me. Philip Adrian wants to know how you see the certification for the Boeing 737-700 and 737-10 going forward.
Yeah, the good news is the language, I think the latest congressional language seems to allow for that exemption. I think it's been finalized, not 100%, don't quote me on that, but I think the exemption that people were so concerned about has been granted. And that, of course, allows them to not have to completely redo the cockpit and lose all commonality with the MAX 8, MAX 9. So that was good news for Boeing. It looks like MAX 7 will happen this year. MAX 10, no. I mean, there's so much I don't understand about program execution at Boeing, and there's a bit of a lack of compelling explanations for it. But it does, the good news is it looks like they're back on track, and at least the legal framework that everyone had been so concerned about seems to have been dealt with. It's just a question of executing now.
Yeah, to a question on the commercial side, and if anybody else has any other questions, we have a few more minutes left if you want to, but I think we've gone through all the chat and Q&A questions for now. Remember there's a lot of talk about on the commercial side, the leisure market leading the way out before the business market, which I think happened. And, but now we're seeing anybody who's tried to book a flight almost anywhere, seeing what's happened with airfares, trying to book a Christmas trip and the difference between what it costs this year compared to last year, for example, and so forth. Have you all done any work on, looking at trends and, where's the breaking point where the fares and, the supply and demand in terms of that leads to the airlines having trouble attracting customers?
Yeah, we're not there yet. Our friends at Aviation Week this week have a really interesting article about the struggles for profitability in most of the major airlines. So clearly balancing, there are higher costs, and passing them on to the consumer is still a challenge, because at the end of the day, people are concerned about the fragility of the recovery, so they're reluctant to raise prices. I know that sounds out of sync, because God knows I'm flying economy class to Paris and I just paid $2,000.
Yeah.
Was that a thing, right?
Yeah.
I know it seems high, but still that profitability balance just doesn't seem to be there. On the other hand, the sort of financial hemorrhage we saw, that's gone. The airlines are out of the woods for the most part. It's just a question of getting that balance right. I expect as costs come down, particularly for energy, but hopefully maybe conceivably for labor, or at least the pace of accelerated costs come down, that this becomes an easier challenge. One problem, of course, is that the airlines, they've been as mindful as everybody at the prospects of a recession. So when that kind of environment, people are reluctant to increase fares. Maybe if we keep going with these really strong economic numbers, they'll feel emboldened. And I don't know why I'm optimistic about that. I don't like paying more than anybody does.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people had money saved up that they didn't spend or whatever. And certainly the airfares turned a hoped for 2-week trip to Switzerland this August into a 2-week drive to Canada, which is my favorite non-US country. So it's going to be great. But, it's, I think that's the world we're living in. Jan or Jan, to be honest, I apologize. I don't know which it is. Medema writes, Richard, what is your outlook on aircraft retirements, replacements, considering the increased deliveries versus air traffic growth?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And boy, the last year or two, of course, saw some shockingly low retirement numbers. But look at the first quarter that came out. That was a significant uptick. And that shows you, of course, the capacity is coming online from new build. It shows you that the price for used and serviceable material has increased to the point where it makes sense to part out a lot of those older jets. It shows that that profitability at airlines is up, so people are now able to, take a loss associated with some retirements against those profits. Mm-hmm. So all the, I guess all the pieces seem to be in place for a continued strong uptick in retirements. That's my conclusion.
Well, Philip Adrian has another sort of workforce question. I'm going to pair it with one I have. Philip wants to know how do you see the impact of the salary raises for especially pilots affecting profitability given the first quarter results from the major U.S. carriers. After you answer that one, I want to ask you a question about the New York area air traffic controller shortage issue. And that's its impact.
Yeah, but we'll both relate to the issue of shortage, which I'm always quick to say isn't really a thing in a market economy. I understand why people use the term, but ultimately you're talking about upward pressure on costs. Mm-hmm. The problem with pilot wages is that they tend to be sticky, right? Because you tend to get long contracts and of course, whatever else. All this to mean that this is, another thing airlines have to be mindful of. And that's why you typically have this tension. But you go back to the first slide I showed or second slide I showed about one of the great changes in the world's economy, that for 50 years, the world's economy has been constrained by inadequate demand, and now it's constrained by inadequate supply. And whether it's pilots or air traffic controllers, those are perfect illustrations of that, which means I think from a manager perspective, you've just got to think in terms of a new universe. I would argue that, the culture of I call it Jack Welch culture for want of a better term. Every year we're going to fire our 10% worst performers. We're going to treat workers like commodities. Sorry, your job is over. That might be ill-advised in this kind of new macroeconomic environment. You might want to treat them as a partner, as a resource, something like that. And hopefully the mindset will change before the cost pressures become too severe, because frankly, nothing increases pressures more than an alienated and annoyed workforce.
I think that's your greatest understatement of the day. Well, and the question and we're running out of time here. So if anybody else has a question, please throw it into the Q&A or chat right away. One concern about the New York controller problem is, you have the federal government asking airlines to take capacity out. And what they're doing, of course, they'll take frequency out and probably upgauge so they can keep seats in. I get that. But I remember, in 1993, there was this, they were still debating 15 years later, deregulation of routes and fares wasn't a good idea. And I was part of the commission that put an end to that debate, and no more, deregulation is a good idea. And now it's sort of it's kind of backdoor re-regulation again, isn't it?
It really is. And it makes you wonder, coupled with the global move towards, again, closed borders, subsidies, is there the risk of sliding back on deregulation like that? And it becomes a real temptation. And, some of the moves by the EU or the Biden administration that at first seem like a good deal for consumers, but then you realize it's also easy to see that they could go too far with that and put too much pressure on businesses. So it's absolutely worth looking at and being concerned about, because at the end of the day, free markets worked fine. We might have gone too far in a few places, I don't know, but in terms of, the worst economic system in the world, not counting all the others, right?
Yeah, I have to paraphrase Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it looks like we're out of questions in the chat and Q&A. We've done just about an hour. I mean, I could I could have these conversations with you all day, and I think most of the people who tuned in, and many more who will watch the recording, and just for those of you who are on, we will send out, the recording of this, and we will, also make the slides available to you. Oh, by the way, Catherine Creedy wrote in the chat, right now, re-regulation is all talk, no action, looking as if they're doing something when they actually don't want to.
Well, I trust Catherine. She's been, she's been looking at these issues for a long time, so she'd know.
Having once worked in politics, that happens sometimes, looking like people wanting to look like they're doing something when they're not actually doing it. Well, thank you all very much for tuning into this. Thank you, Richard, for your time and expertise. I love these conversations. You always take such a big macro look at everything. And enjoy the rest of that. Enjoy the rest of that beer. I'll be thinking about you when I have my Aviation gin martini in a couple of hours. And thank you all for tuning in, and thank you for your support of the National Aeronautic Association and the future Intergalactic Aeronautic Association. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.